The Andersons' house always felt a little too quiet. It wasn't the sort of quiet that brought peace or restfulness. Instead, it had the weight of anticipation, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As I pulled up to their driveway that evening, my headlights washed over the stark outline of the house, its white shutters gleaming under the pale moonlight. The sprawling forest at its back loomed like a shadowy audience, each tree a silent onlooker. Mrs. Anderson greeted me at the door, her usual warm demeanor muted. "Thanks for coming on such short notice, Ellie," she said, handing me a list of emergency numbers and a note about the kids' bedtime routine. "It's no problem," I replied, masking the hesitation in my voice. As she gathered her coat, I noticed her glancing toward the staircase behind me. It was a fleeting look, but it carried an edge of unease that made my skin prickle. She seemed to catch herself and smiled too brightly. "They're already asleep," she said quickly. "Should be an easy night." I nodded, brushing off my own nerves as they left. Once the door clicked shut, the silence closed in. I wandered into the living room, the familiar warmth of the fireplace doing little to ease the creeping tension. The clock on the mantel ticked with deliberate slowness, each second stretching longer than the last. I busied myself checking on the children, Sammy, 7, and his sister Clara, 5. Both were tucked beneath their blankets, their soft breathing the only sound in the stillness. Returning downstairs, I settled onto the couch, the hum of the television a welcome reprieve from the oppressive quiet. But even the sitcom's canned laughter couldn't drown out the house's subtle sounds. At first, it was just the creak of wood settling, a perfectly ordinary sound in a house this old. But then came a faint rustling, as if someone was brushing against the walls upstairs. I muted the TV, listening intently. The sound stopped. I shook my head, feeling ridiculous. It's an old house, I told myself. Nothing more. The minutes ticked by, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. Every shadow seemed to lengthen unnaturally, the dim light casting shapes that stretched too far across the walls. I tried to focus on the TV, but my eyes kept drifting toward the darkened hallway that led to the stairs. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, just audible enough to make my heart skip. I froze, gripping the edge of the couch. It was faint, but distinct, coming from the direction of the staircase. A breathy, indiscernible murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling in the silence. No response. I stood, the weight of my unease pressing against my chest. Slowly I moved toward the base of the stairs, peering into the darkness above. "Sammy? Clara?" I called softly, hoping it was one of the kids stirring in their sleep. The house answered with silence. I stood there for a long moment, torn between investigating and retreating to the safety of the living room. Finally, I convinced myself it was nothing, perhaps the sound of the wind brushing against the eaves. But as I turned away, I could swear I heard it again, quieter this time but unmistakable. A whisper from the shadows. By the time the clock struck 10, the whispers had stopped. At least, I thought they had. I clung to the hope that my imagination had gotten the better of me, that the strange sounds were nothing more than the house settling or the hum of appliances. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. To distract myself, I busied my hands with chores. The Andersons' sink was piled with dishes, their countertops cluttered with the debris of a busy family. Scrubbing plates under the steady flow of water, I tried to let the rhythmic task soothe me. But every so often, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, and my pulse quickened. Behind me, the living room stretched in shadows. The dishes done, I returned to the couch, curling up under a blanket. The house was cold now, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The TV murmured softly in the background, but my attention kept straying to the darkened hallway. Then, A sound broke the quiet, a creak from the second floor. My breath hitched as I stared toward the staircase. The sound was deliberate, heavier than before, as if someone had shifted their weight. "Sammy? Clara?" I called again, trying to steady my voice. No answer. Grabbing the flashlight from the side table, I made my way upstairs. Each step felt like an eternity, the old wood groaning under my weight. The hallway was bathed in shadow, the faint moonlight from a nearby window barely illuminating the doors on either side. The children's room was just ahead. I peeked inside, relief washing over me as I saw them sound asleep. I stepped back, closing the door quietly, but as I turned, my flashlight beam flickered, and then I heard it again. Soft, almost imperceptible. A whisper. This time it was closer. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams across the hallway. For a moment I thought I saw something, movement in the corner of my eye, a shape slipping into the shadows. My chest tightened, my legs frozen in place. I forced myself to move, retreating downstairs with shaky breaths. Back on the couch, I clutched the flashlight tightly, its weight oddly comforting. The whispers didn't come again, but the silence that followed was worse. The minutes stretched into hours, each second punctuated by the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. My flashlight lay on the couch beside me, its weight a constant reminder of my earlier panic. I kept my eyes fixed on the television, though I wasn't paying attention to the cheerful sitcom reruns. I was listening, waiting for the house to betray its secrets. The faint hum of static from the muted TV was the only sound. But the silence had an oppressive quality now, pressing against my ears like a heavy fog. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement near the base of the stairs. I froze, my heart lurching into my throat. The shadow lingered just out of sight, blending with the darkness of the hallway. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it moved again, slipping toward the living room's edge, so faint it was almost imperceptible. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers trembling as I switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty space where the shadow had been. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice barely louder than a whisper. The room answered with silence, but I felt the distinct weight of eyes on me, as if something, or someone, was watching. The air felt heavier now, thick and cold, and I fought the urge to flee. My rational mind insisted that there was nothing there, but the tiny hairs on my arms prickled with instinctive fear. I kept the flashlight on, its beam darting across the room as I checked every corner, every shadow. Nothing. I sank back onto the couch, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. My heart refused to settle, each beat pounding against my ribs. The whispers returned. They were faint at first, a soft murmur that seemed to echo from the walls. Then they grew louder, clearer, wrapping around me like invisible hands. They weren't words I could understand, more like fragmented syllables, spoken in a language that didn't belong here. "Who's there?" I called again, louder this time. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a vacuum of silence that was even more unnerving. I felt it then, a presence. The sense of being watched intensified, becoming almost unbearable. My eyes darted toward the darkened corner near the fireplace, where the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally. For a moment I thought I saw it, a shape, impossibly tall and narrow, standing perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. A sound broke the silence, the soft creak of a door hinge upstairs. My blood ran cold as I realized it was the children's room. Clutching the flashlight, I bolted to the staircase, my feet barely making a sound against the creaking wood. When I reached the landing, I saw that their door was ajar. My heart pounded as I pushed it open, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the room. Sammy and Clara were still asleep, their small forms bundled beneath their blankets. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. But then I saw it. The closet door was open. The Andersons' closet was always closed. Mrs. Anderson had mentioned it once, offhandedly, when showing me the house. The door sticks sometimes, she'd said. Best to just leave it shut. But now it was wide open, revealing a dark, gaping space that seemed far larger than I remembered. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped closer, peering into the shadows. "Sammy, Clara," I whispered, checking over my shoulder to confirm they were still asleep. The closet was empty, at least at first glance. But as the beam of my flashlight swept over the back wall, I noticed something strange. The surface wasn't smooth like the others. It was rough, uneven, as though the wood had been replaced or reinforced. And in the center, almost hidden by shadows, was a small, circular handle. My pulse quickened. I knelt and reached out, hesitating for a moment before grasping the cold metal. With a soft tug, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to shut the door and leave. But something about the passage called to me, a quiet compulsion I couldn't explain. I glanced back at the children, still sound asleep, and whispered a promise to myself. Just a quick look. The air inside was damp and musty, carrying a faint metallic tang. My flashlight's beam barely reached the bottom of the stairs, which seemed to spiral endlessly into the earth. Each step groaned under my weight, the sound reverberating in the confined space. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, circular room. Its walls were lined with old, yellowed newspaper clippings, their edges curling with age. In the center of the room sat a wooden table, its surface scarred and scratched, as though it had been used for something far rougher than meals. A single journal lay on the table, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it cautiously, the pages filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. The entries were dated decades ago, detailing a family that once lived in the house. They wrote about the whispers, about shadows that moved on their own. And then, on the last page, scrawled in jagged letters, "Do not listen, do not follow." The hair on the back of my neck prickled as the whispers returned, louder now, reverberating in the small room. My flashlight flickered, and I spun around, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway. There was nothing. Clutching the journal, I fled back up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. When I reached the children's room, I slammed the closet door shut and locked it, my heart racing. The house was quiet again, but the silence carried a new weight. I sat on the floor outside their room, the journal clutched in my lap. Something was wrong with this house, something deeper, darker than I had ever imagined. The journal rested on my lap, its weight heavier than it should have been, as if the words it held bore the weight of something ancient and unrelenting. The Andersons' house was quiet again, but the silence was no comfort. It pressed down on me, thick and oppressive, like the house was waiting for me to make a mistake. The clock struck midnight. The chime echoed through the empty hallways, each note lingering unnaturally, almost vibrating through the air. The flashlight in my hand flickered, its beam sputtering as though it were fighting to stay alive. And then, the whispers started again. This time they were louder, clearer. They weren't words, not exactly. More like fragments of thought, broken and distorted, brushing against my ears like icy breath. The sound wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was everywhere. I gripped the flashlight tightly, forcing myself to move. The journal's cryptic warning, "Do not listen, do not follow," replayed in my mind like a broken record. But something deeper, something primal, urged me forward. The hallway stretched before me, darker than I remembered. The faint moonlight from the windows seemed dimmer, swallowed by shadows that danced and twisted in unnatural patterns. My footsteps were muffled, the floor creaking just enough to remind me of how alone I was. But I wasn't alone. The air behind me grew colder, heavy with the undeniable sense of being watched. I turned sharply, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. For a fleeting moment, I saw it, a shadow taller than the ceiling, its edges shifting like smoke. It didn't move, but its presence filled the hallway, suffocating and wrong. I stumbled back, my heart hammering as the flashlight flickered again. When the beam steadied, the shadow was gone. The whispers swelled, overlapping now, their fragmented syllables forming a cacophony that made my head throb. My thoughts felt slower, heavier, as though they were being drowned out by the voices. I forced myself to focus on the journal, flipping to the last page where the frantic warning was scrawled. Beneath it, written in faint, almost illegible handwriting, was another line I hadn't noticed before. It wants you to see. It wants you to choose. I didn't understand what it meant, but the words settled into my chest like a stone. The floor beneath me creaked, the sound sharp and sudden, and I realized I was standing in front of the basement door. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, drawn by a force I couldn't resist. The stairs were steeper than I remembered, their descent feeling endless. At the bottom, the faint glow of the flashlight revealed the circular room again, but something had changed. The walls no longer held newspaper clippings. Instead, they were covered in writing, jagged, looping letters that seemed to move in the flickering light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or old blood. The table in the center of the room was empty, save for a single unlit candle. The whispers were louder here, a throbbing hum that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where shadows gathered thickest, the figure stood. It wasn't quite human. Its form was too tall, too narrow, its limbs bending at impossible angles. Its face, or where a face should have been, was a void, a black expanse that drew my gaze like a whirlpool. It raised a hand, impossibly long fingers extending toward the candle. The flame sparked to life, casting a flickering glow that barely reached the edges of the room. The whispers stopped. For the first time, the silence felt worse. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, and I understood its message without words. It was waiting, for me. I clutched the journal tightly, the words on its pages burning in my mind. Do not listen, do not follow. But now I understood the choice it had mentioned. Whatever this thing was, it wanted something from me. I took a shaky step back, my instincts screaming at me to run. But as I turned toward the stairs, the shadows shifted, closing in like a living thing. The way back was gone. There was no escape. The figure remained still, the flickering candlelight casting its distorted shadow across the walls. Its presence filled the room, vast and consuming. I could feel it reaching into my mind, urging me forward. My hand hovered over the candle, my breath shallow and rapid. I didn't know what would happen if I extinguished it. Perhaps it would end the whispers, the shadows, the unease that had plagued the house. Or perhaps it would seal something far worse. I closed my eyes, the journal's warning echoing in my thoughts. When I opened them again, the figure was gone. The whispers had stopped. I climbed the stairs in silence, the house eerily still. The children were still asleep, untouched by the night's horrors. I placed the journal back in the closet and shut the door, locking it firmly. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows. The house, though quiet, felt different, watchful, as though it was waiting for something. I left before the Andersons returned, my chest heavy with unanswered questions. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the house were still watching, waiting.